Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video, I've got episode 4 of FPL Psychology 101. This is the series where I take key concepts and theories from the field of psychology and apply them to FPL, either to optimize the way in which we make decisions and hopefully shoot us up the ranks, or to improve the way we approach the game, sometimes discussing things around mental health as well. In today's video, we're going to approach the dark side of social media, or more accurately, we're going to explore whether there are some aspects of social media which might affect the way we make decisions, and if these are in a negative fashion, we're going to discuss how we can maybe deal with these, approach these, or at least acknowledge them when we make our eventual FPL decisions. If you are new to this channel and you want to know a little bit about myself and why you should listen to what I'm saying around psychology, I have been studying psychology for almost 10 years now. So I studied psychology at GCSE and A level, then went on to university. I've got a bachelor's degree in psychology. I've got a master's degree in sport and exercise psychology. I'm currently doing a PhD in sports psychology as well, looking at the role of virtual reality in skill acquisition. I also teach bachelor's sports science students, sport and exercise psychology as well. So I am also a lecturer, and therefore I guess I'm a student, I'm a lecturer, and on top of being both of those things and just having a passion in psychology, I have indeed written a book applying the psychological aspects to Fantasy Premier League. The book is called The Mind Game, so that's what that poster is behind me if you ever wonder what that is. So if you are interested in psychology, you enjoy these Psychology 101 videos and you've not yet picked up a book, there is so many different concepts and theories applied in this book to FPL. Also, it will just give you some life lessons in general, and there are some questionnaires throughout which will give you an idea about who you are as a manager and what makes you tick. And again, these will apply to your everyday life and hopefully make you a better manager and potentially a better person as well. So today we're going to discuss social media, lots and lots to discuss. So we're going to jump into it. Without further ado, let's get into today's video. So guys, before we jump into today's video, I just want to give a massive shout out to Ultimate Champions, who will be sponsoring some of the videos here on this channel for the foreseeable future. Ultimate Champions are the new era of fantasy football. They're the first play-to-earn game powered by the blockchain. What I want you to do is imagine a cross between FIFA, trading cards, and fantasy football, and you arrive with Ultimate Champions. Ultimate Champions is essentially a game where you can trade and collect very rare forms of cards. You can do so by opening packs as well, or by trading on the market. And once you've got your club of cards, you can basically play fantasy football on a weekly basis with weekly competitions. The better your players perform in real life, the more points you score, and the better the rewards you get. And then you can build up those rare cards and show them off to your friends, family, and colleagues. This is an incredibly exciting project. The beta's not quite live yet, but you can do two things to get on board with this project now, rather than waiting until it's too late. You can firstly follow their Twitter account and you can get updates on when the game goes live and also updates around competitions. But more importantly, you can join their Discord community, which is continuing to grow. I'm in the Discord community. I do have an OG role, but by joining the Discord community, you can potentially get not only updates, but you can get some free packs and you can get the opportunity to get an OG role where you can become an OG member of the Discord community. And in doing so, you can basically associate yourself with the start of this new era of fantasy football. So you want to get this on this sooner rather than later. Both those links are down in the description below. Thank you so much to Ultimate Champions for sponsoring this video. Definitely get involved with this project, guys. I'll be playing the game no matter what, and I just think it's very, very exciting. But let's jump into Psychology 101. So guys, let's jump into it. Today's video will be split into 8 parts. You'll have all of the timestamps below, as always, if you want to skip to a specific section. But I do build a narrative throughout, and hopefully you'll be interested in every single part, fingers crossed anyway. We're moving away from cognitive psychology now. By cognitive psychology, we mean cognitions, and we're looking at the way that people think with respect to decision making and how to optimize that. Moving towards social psychology now, which looks at the way that people react and behave with respect to their social relationships in a social setting. Obviously, we are looking at social media here, and therefore that does make sense. The first thing I want to talk about is this idea of a social media bubble. And this is the concept that sometimes we can be completely engrossed by what we're doing on social media. And we think that that can be our entire world, and that can be entirely representative of the thing or topic that we are discussing. And that definitely applies to FPL. So the best way to basically represent this is to go through some of the numbers and explain how much social media represents the entire FPL database. So the most followed account at the time of me recording this is Fantasy, obviously outside the official FPL account, but that has got a lot of bots following it. That's got a lot of people that don't really follow. They're just following the Premier League, etc. So the most followed FPL dedicated account is Fantasy Football Scout, and they're approaching 250,000 followers on Twitter, so 248,700 followers. Now, as I said, there are a lot of what we call bots or robots following that. By this, we mean that there are a lot of accounts that are created just based on an algorithm. They aren't real people. Outside of that, Fantasy Football Scout have been going for sort of 10 to 12 years. So you would assume a lot of those accounts have either deactivated or they potentially just aren't active. And out of those accounts, you've also got some that we would call like lingerers who will not discuss FPL. They won't have FPL in their handle. They'll literally just follow to get a bit of information. So I wouldn't say that they would discuss FPL enough for you to say that they are representative of the database, because they're not going to discuss it with you. So out of those 250,000, I would say a maximum, and I think this is probably massively overreaching, but I'd say a maximum of about 50,000 of those are dedicated FPL accounts. Now, I don't mean that they necessarily have to have FPL in their handle or in their name, but what I mean is they will discuss FPL. So they will be in people's comments, they will be in DMs, and they will be discussing the game regularly enough to say that they are an FPL dedicated account. I think this number could be as low as about 10 or 15,000, but we'll say 50,000 as a maximum. In FPL, there are actually approaching 9 million teams created now, but we'll say 8 million teams because that's been the case for the last couple of years. Again, so many people create multiple teams. Just regular people like you and I mean, I've only got the one team, but regular people sometimes create multiple teams. But also there are systems out there, again, algorithms that create up to like 100,000 teams. And in doing so, try to win the game by creating so many different variations of teams. I would argue that probably only about 4 to 5 million of those are unique teams. I mean, again, it's very, very difficult to do the maths for this. FPL are introducing two-factor authentication next season, and in doing so, it will remove a lot of these sort of bot teams, these multiple created teams. But I would guess that around 4 million of these are unique teams. So if we've got around 4 million unique teams, and we've got around 50,000 dedicated FPL accounts, what we're saying is that at most, Twitter probably only represents 1.25% of players in the database. That's a remarkable number. Now, again, if you think that the dedicated FPL accounts is significantly lower than that, maybe 10,000, and if you think that the unique teams is actually as many as 5 or 6 million, that could drop below 1%. That could be as little as about 0.5%. Now, again, if you go the other way and you say, well, actually, there might be 250,000 accounts and there might be 8 million teams, then of course it might go a little bit higher. But we're looking at definitely less than 10% of the databases on FPL Twitter. And I would extend that across Reddit and Instagram and Facebook as well. So I guess what I'm trying to get here is we can be completely engrossed with what's going on Twitter. Oh, this FPL Twitter are bringing in this player. I've got to bring them in because they're going to be 200% effective ownership. Everyone on Twitter's captaining this player. Therefore, they're going to be the most captain player in FPL. And sometimes that just isn't the case. I've had this sort of fear of missing out where I can see all of FPL Twitter bringing in a player and I'm like, oh no, this player's going to be owned by everyone. Everyone's going to captain it. My rank is going to be absolutely demolished. And then the deadline swings around and they've got like 30 or 40% effective ownership. And we can just call that almost a Twitter bandwagon or something that's happened in the Twitter bubble. So the point of this is to realize that Twitter is a fantastic resource, which we're going to discuss later, and social media can be fantastic for us, but it isn't the be-all and end-all, and it's not completely representative of what is going on. The one thing that I will acknowledge, because I know it'll be discussed in the comments, is that Twitter probably represents a larger percentage of the top 10K managers or the top elite managers. I would argue that probably around 5 to 10% of the top 10K managers are probably on Twitter. That being that often the very, very best managers do use Twitter as a resource for their FPL decision making. I will acknowledge that, but still, again, I do believe that we're talking about less than 10%. So let me know down below what you think of these numbers and these statistics. This is just a rough estimate based on my interpretation of what is going on. But the key thing is, FPL Twitter is not the be-all and end-all. It's not completely representative. And sometimes there are things going on outside of FPL Twitter, and we do need to explore those as well. Right, I need to refrain myself from getting too carried away here because I absolutely love the topic of risk-taking. I studied it during my bachelor's. I did a project on risk-taking as well. And there is a whole chapter in the mind game on risk-taking. So perhaps, let me know down below if you'd want this. We could do an entire video on risk-taking in FPL. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is how much social media can amplify risk-taking behaviors. And there is significantly more research now being done on this due to the explosion of social media in the recent sort of years. However, there is still also a lot of research which looks at this already done. So one piece of research which I wanted to draw your attention to, now there is a lot of research, it's by O'Brien et al. In 2011, but there is a lot of research in this. And there is research to suggest that the mere presence of one single peer or a friend of some kind can be enough to increase risk-taking behaviors. Now, I'm not talking about a friend egging you on and encouraging you to take risks. I am talking about literally the mere presence of them. So just having one friend in the room or one friend near you or one friend on WhatsApp or whatever it may be talking to you is enough to increase the manner in which you take risks by a significant amount. Now, O'Brien et al. Studied this via a game of what we call chicken. Now, chicken is where you have a car going along, or the virtual game in psychology. You have a car going along, And there's various sets of traffic lights, tend to be about 15 sets of traffic lights. And often the traffic lights will be green, sometimes they'll be red and you'll stop, sometimes they'll be amber. And often when it's amber, a brick wall will go up as it's amber, as you're going along, and you'll hit the brick wall. So the decision you need to make is, do you risk the potential of this brick wall going up and still go along and risk hitting it, or do you stop, wait to see, and then go along? So essentially it is measuring your risk-taking behaviors, and it's almost like a gamble. Do you take the risk of going through this amber light or not? Now, in real life, I don't ever recommend going through the amber light, but of course in this game, the consequences aren't as high. And what they found was, when you did this task alone, you did the chicken task alone, there was significantly less risk taking. Normally, when the amber light was there, you would stop, you would assess, and then you would go. However, if there was literally, as I said, one peer in the room, one friend in the room with you, just being there, not making any noise, not encouraging you, participants took significantly more risks. And that's incredible. Like I said, they're not even encouraging you to take risks. It's just the presence of them there, potentially wanting to show your social superiority or showing that you are a risk taker, showing that you're exciting. Again, making those comparisons with other people and trying to show that you are a better person or a more exciting person. Now, it was significantly high in adolescents versus adults. So if you are a younger age, if you're watching this, you're maybe between the age of sort of 16 and 18, then you are more susceptible to this. And the older you get, the less likely you are to adhere to this risk taking in the presence of peers. However, there were still risk-taking behaviors in adults as well. Now, the reason that I wanted to draw your attention to this with respect to social media, I've just pulled a recent tweet. This was a couple of days ago. There are some that have got over 1 million in recent times as well. But this is one of my recent tweets where I celebrated hitting 10,000 subscribers. And if you're watching this and you do subscribe, thank you so much. If not, subscribe and become one of the Raptor family. But one of my recent tweets where I celebrated and said, just thank you so much for hitting 10,000 subscribers, that received 148,000 impressions. So what that essentially means is 148,000 people, again, some of these might have been bots or people might have just been quickly scrolling, but essentially 148,000 people saw that tweet. If you consider the fact that the presence of one peer is enough to amplify decision-making by a significant amount, can you imagine what the presence or the known knowledge that 148,000 people are seeing my tweets can do to risk-taking behaviors? Now, again, some people might have bigger accounts, some people might have smaller accounts, but just the mere presence of others on social media can be enough to encourage risk-taking. And what I would say, in comparison to that study looking at the chicken game to social media, on social media, we actively egg each other on. If you ever run a poll which says, should I take a -8 or not, yes or no, I guarantee that yes will receive the most votes, and people are just desperate to see others take risks, because we as human beings, we want to take risks. And if we can't do that, what we like to do is live vicariously through others. So if we're not brave enough, I guess, or sometimes silly enough to take risks, we egg others on and we encourage others because we want to see if those risks would have paid off. And so what I would say is be very, very careful with asking for opinions on social media to the mass public, because what you could get is over 100,000 people seeing it, and some of those encouraging you to take risks. And in doing so, you're significantly more likely to take risks. So I'll stop it there because I just find it such an interesting topic. I could talk about it for hours, but just beware that when you're on social media, it'll probably amplify risk-taking behaviors, and sometimes it'll encourage you to take risky decisions which just aren't the correct decision to make. So I'd be very, very careful when running polls. I'd be very, very careful when asking for popular decisions just in popular media. And what I would do is seek advice from a few. So maybe go to DMs, speak to some people that you trust, rather than seeking the advice of the general FPL Twitter community. Let's move on to part 3. So for part 3, just to illustrate my point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out some underlying statistics from player X and player Y. What I'd like you to do is let me know down below before I reveal which player is player X and which player is player Y. Let me know who you think they are based on the underlying statistics and see if you can guess which these two players are. So player X, here's some underlying statistics for you, and I'm going to just read it out as it is on the screen. This player ranks 2nd in the Premier League for expected goals per 90, 4th in the league for expected FPL points per 90, and has delivered the 5th highest goals per 90 in the Premier League this season. He is one of the most valuable assets in the game. You must buy him. Right, so that's player X. Player Y. This player ranks 17th in the league for expected assists per 90, 11th for total shots per 90, and is underperforming his expected goals by minus 0.08, so not great, underperforming his expected goals. These stats are mediocre at best, and there are certainly better assets to buy. So let me know down below who you think player X and player Y are. You might have clocked on based on the fact that this is called the framing effect, but player X and player Y are the same player, and that is Diogo Jota. Now, the point I'm trying to illustrate here is the framing effect, in that on social media, we can frame things positively or negatively, and we can manipulate what should be objective statistics based on the narrative that we want to build or the bias that we might previously have. So if I was someone that was trying to convince you to bring in Jota, I would frame it in the way of player X. I would say, you've got to buy him. These are some fantastic statistics. And I would cherry pick the statistics which look really good. And if I didn't want to bring in Jota, I might write a thread, write an article, present on YouTube even to some extent, and say, listen, this player's got 17th for expected assists per 90, 11th for total shots. They're not taking that many shots. They're performing their expected goals, so maybe they're a poor finisher. There are definitely better assets to buy. So you can see that just with the same set of underlying statistics, you can frame things completely differently. And this is so dangerous because we are so reliant on others creating research for us often. A lot of us don't want to go and do all this research. We don't want to head over to these sites and sort of trawl through the data and go through and try and find out which player is the best. And a lot of us will just absorb content. And some of you might watch my videos and might rely on me for this. And this is why I don't do this. And this is why it's so critical. If you're a content creator and you're advising someone who to buy, don't frame it based on your cognitive biases. And it's really difficult to avoid doing this. But just go through all the data. And if you can, try and present all the data. And that's why often with my big tables, I've got so much data. That's not to try and confuse you. That's just to try and present the whole picture. I try and create or portray the entire portrait for you, just so that you know that I'm not cherry picking different statistics. And this can be the case with sample size as well. Sometimes you can manipulate the sample size by one game and it can completely skew the data. And if that is the case, try and tell your audience, try and tell the people reading or listening that in doing so, if you just adjust the sample size, these statistics do change. So that is the framing effect. It sort of links into narrative bias as well. We live the world through stories. We live the world through narratives. And if we can create an exciting or interesting narrative, sometimes that can be easier to listen to. So sometimes in these threads, someone creates this narrative that Kane's back in form and Kane's got that confidence back and Kane always scores against Leicester, so you've got to bring him in before this game. And we like these narratives. And so be careful of people framing, be careful of the narrative bias. And one of my favorites, and I think it's such an interesting one because I definitely fall victim to this, is belief bias. Now, belief bias is where the conclusion of a thread, article, podcast, YouTube video is so convincing and significantly more convincing than the body of the text that we can just completely trust that opinion. So you can see I've actually incorporated belief bias into these two examples. So the statistics don't really matter. If I come in with a strong conclusion, I say he is one of the most valuable assets in the game, you must buy him. By looking the camera in the eye and saying must, and he is one of the most valuable assets, really, sometimes you can completely not listen to the rest of the statistics. I could even say this player ranks 17th in the league for expected assists, 11th for total shots per 90. He's only underperforming his expected goals by 0.08. Great finishing. He is one of the most valuable assets. So you can even sometimes present mediocre statistics, but if you have a strong punch, a conclusion that's convincing, you can basically encourage people to buy a player that might not be the player to buy. Now, my advice for this is stop skipping to the conclusion, reading the conclusion, and if you enjoy the conclusion, then reading the body of text. My advice would be, don't read the conclusion first, read the body of text, read the article, listen to the video, and before the content creator gives a conclusion, pause the video, stop reading the article and think, based on those underlying statistics, number one, do I think the content creator's been framing? Do I think they're building a narrative? And three, what would be my conclusion without having seen theirs? What would I conclude based on these numbers? Then read their conclusion. Sometimes you'll see the conclusion just doesn't match up, or the conclusion is completely sensationalized and makes you feel like you've got to bring that player. So the example that I use in the book is people that talk about the Vardy party. That gives you such like a fear of missing out. That's such a convincing sort of conclusion that, oh, there's going to be a Vardy party this weekend and you've got to jump on because you don't want to miss out on that. And you think, yeah, I don't want to miss out on this Vardy party. I'm going to bring in that player. So there are a few sort of cognitive biases here. I said we're looking at social psychology, but these are a little bit cognitive as well. Beware of the framing effect, beware of narrative bias, and beware of belief bias as well. Basically, do your own research. Make sure you are thinking with a critical frame of mind and realize that not purposely, but sometimes content creators without meaning to can frame stuff in a different way, can fall victim to creating a different narrative that maybe isn't real, and also have such a convincing conclusion that they convince you to bring in a player that maybe the stats don't support. Let's move on to part 4. So part 4 is discussing two quite prevalent words used in popular media, and that is groupthink and herd mentality. Now, normally these two words are used interchangeably, and if you're not particularly interested in psychology, you can use these two words interchangeably, but they do actually represent two different concepts. However, they normally have the same end outcome, hence them being used interchangeably in social media and popular media. But herd mentality is about where an individual's belief or actions align with the majority in which they interact with. So this is why it's amplified on social media. It could be that you're not sure who to captain in FPL and you're sort of thinking around, but you can see the majority of social media, the majority of FPL Twitter are all leaning towards captaining Jota. And across the week, that majority will start to build. They'll all start to lean towards captaining Jota. So at the end of the week, everyone is captaining Jota on social media. It's almost where we get these sort of bandwagon effects. That is through herd mentality. Now, as an individual, if you weren't on social media, you might not arrive at that captaining Jota decision because you weren't sure. You were looking at all of the data. But over time, the more you interact with people, the more social interactions you have, over time, you would start to align your beliefs and your actions and your eventual end outcome of captaining Jota with the community. And therefore, you essentially develop the mentality of the herd. And as we've said, that's why social media is so dangerous, because social media is basically herd mentality on a mass scale. It amplifies herd mentality because rather than it being in a group of 2 or 3 people all aligning their beliefs, it can be hundreds of thousands of people. And again, that's why it's so dangerous. But that's what herd mentality is. It's that alignment of beliefs. Groupthink is slightly different. Groupthink is almost the deliberate desire to maintain harmony within a group. And as such, you don't bring up things that might disrupt that harmony or might cause potential arguments or different discussions. And as a result, yeah, you just essentially adopt the viewpoint of the majority, which again links to herd mentality, but it's more so about not wanting to disrupt that harmony. Now, the example that I'm going to give is actually a bit of history. I studied this at history during my A-levels. Now, this is an incredibly sad event, but it's one which really demonstrates groupthink, and it's one which we've learned a lot from as a society and as an entire world, really. And this was essentially the thing that kickstarted a lot of the research into groupthink and has put in a lot of guidelines in place which doesn't allow this to happen again. But in 1986, NASA launched an orbiter into the sky known as the Challenger. Now, this was later coined the Challenger shuttle disaster because 73 seconds after takeoff, 7 members were killed as the orbiter exploded. Now, we can explore why that happened afterwards, and it is linked to groupthink, but obviously incredibly sad event. You can go and watch documentaries on this over on YouTube. There are also some documentaries on TV as well. It is very, very interesting, obviously very sad as well, so only watch it if you're willing to take that, but something which we can draw a lot from. So I've got the notes in front of me just so that I don't get all of the information wrong. So as I said, a team of absolute experts, the very best in their field, somehow had an orbiter explode 73 seconds after takeoff in one of the most important events in history. Now, how did this happen? So one of the most important elements of a Challenger, if you're interested in engineering, you might know this already, is known as the O-ring. Now, this is a small piece of rubber, which apparently is one of the most critical elements for the orbiter in takeoff and also in flight as well. Now, this O-ring is very, very well known for being very, very difficult to work in cold situations, so in cold temperatures. And there is a cutoff point where this O-ring only functions effectively above 53 degrees. So anything below 53 degrees and you've got a serious issue and you should not initiate takeoff because there is a strong likelihood that this won't work very well. Now, on the morning of takeoff, rather than being at the minimum 53 degrees, the launch pad was actually at 36 degrees. So we're talking quite a bit below the standard, 17 degrees below what is satisfactory for takeoff. Now, you might be asking, how did a team of NASA experts allow this to take off then? There was a lot of social pressure at this point. There'd been a lot of money pumped into this NASA project, and basically they had to initiate takeoff that day due to the social pressure. Now, what happened as a result is a few of the engineers spotted this potential issue, spotted the fact that the O-ring was far colder than it could have been for a successful takeoff. But due to the fact that those above them, those authoritarian figures, suggested that we needed to initiate takeoff, there was too much social pressure to not. These engineers didn't want to disrupt this social harmony. They didn't want to disrupt the popular belief that takeoff had to happen. And as a result, they didn't speak up. They saw that there was being a decision made on a mass level to a really terrible scale, but they didn't speak up. And this is groupthink. And it's an incredibly sad event. And you can say, oh, we blame the engineers. That's absolutely terrible. That's not humane. But there are there are discussions taking place in the past where things have been happening due to groupthink. And again, FPL is by far and away nowhere near as extreme as this. But there are often cases when we might think, I don't think this is the correct decision. Everyone appears to be captaining this player, but I'm not sure that this is the player to captain. Or everyone's bringing in this player, but they've not got the best fixtures long term. Their underlying statistics aren't great. But sometimes because so many people are making a decision, because the general mass belief is that this is the correct decision to make, sometimes we don't want to disrupt that harmony. Sometimes we don't want to look silly. And as a result, we just say, well, if everyone's doing that, if everyone's making the same decision, potentially we should be making that decision as well. And that's where we get to groupthink. And it can cause, as is the case with the Challenger disaster, some severe and systematic errors and some severe and systematic errors and cause potential disasters Obviously, in FPL, it's not that extreme, but it's something to bear in mind. And I guess my advice for this is, number one, seek different forms of information. So if you can, try and use stats, try and use eye test, try and use social media. In doing so, you're less likely to miss potential issues such as this. And also, don't be afraid to disrupt the harmony. Don't be afraid to disrupt the status quo, because in doing so, you might raise an issue that the general mass belief might have missed. And in doing so, you might avoid potential mass mistakes. So I'll leave it there. Incredibly sad event, but one which really does demonstrate quite well groupthink. Do go and search for the Challenger disaster, learn about it, because it's something that we can learn about and improve on moving forward. Let's move on to part 5. So something that builds on quite nicely from groupthink and herd mentality is a concept that we can call group polarization. So rather than impacting the content of our decisions, which can sometimes be the case with groupthink, herd mentality, and bandwagons, group polarization doesn't change your opinion, or it doesn't change the thing that you do. It will just shift it from being quite a subtle decision or a small decision to a very extreme decision. So what I've done is I've just created a graphic here to very simply show what this might look like. And I have used the example of Dennis, so apologies, Dennis captainers. If you're watching this in the future, this was the week that a lot of people captained Dennis, and he received a red card and therefore got -2 as a captain in a double game week. Obviously, the decision was fine there. I don't think that was a bad decision, so I'm not saying that was a bad decision at all, but I've used that as the example here. So you might say as yourself, and you wouldn't say this out loud, but your thinking might be, I want to transfer in Dennis this week. I don't own Dennis. He's got a double game week. I think I want to bring him in this week. I'm not 100% set on that, but I do want to transfer in Dennis. So that might be your belief. You then jump on social media, and you can see that everyone and their dog is explaining that Dennis is the best captaincy option. And everywhere you're just seeing thread after thread after thread, great underlying statistics, passing the eye test, his touch map looks fantastic. Lots of people are discussing Dennis is the best captain option. And as a result, what this will do is it will draw your opinion, your first opinion of, I think I want to bring in Dennis. You'll start to think, well, then Dennis is the clear captaincy option. And the more that you see this, not only will you end up with, well, Dennis is the clear captaincy option, it can sometimes polarize and it push that decision even more extreme. And you go above and beyond what even the popular media are doing, what everyone else is doing. And you might end up with the decision, I'm going to triple captain Dennis this week. And I saw quite a few people triple captain Dennis. Now, again, I don't think that was necessarily due to group polarization, but this definitely occurs. And I'm sure you can give me some examples down below where you have succumbed to group polarization, where you start the week thinking, I might bring in this player, or this player might potentially be a good captaincy option. And by the end of the week, you've got that player as your captain 100%, and you are considering playing the triple captaincy chip, and you look at your team and go, how did I end up on that? Or you might be thinking, oh, I might want to bring in a Brighton player for their double game week. I think I might want to have one defender. And then by the end of the week, you've taken a -8 and you've brought in 2 Brighton players, a Manchester United player, and you're thinking, how did I end up on that? And it could be the manner of social media amplifying risk-taking, which we discussed in part 2, or it could be this concept of group polarization. And it does occur in your everyday life, but also on social media, where the more we discuss these things, we'll shift from having quite a subtle, small decision to the very extreme version of that decision. So just beware. If you jump on social media and you're considering making a key decision, you might succumb to group polarization, and as a result, your decision might be pushed towards the extreme. Let's move on to part 6. So this is one which just isn't ever discussed. And I'll be honest, until I wrote The Mind Game, Gaining Psychological Edge in FPL, links in the description, I didn't know what the common knowledge effect was. So again, I've studied at GCSE, A-level, bachelor's, master's, I'm doing a PhD. I'd never come across the common knowledge effect. And it's very interesting because that's almost ironic when you find out what the common knowledge effect is. But it can really limit our potential, and it can limit us at a mass scale, not only in our own individual decision making, but our decision making as a group. And in doing, if you acknowledge this, and you find ways around this, you'll not only benefit your own decision making, but you'll benefit the FPL community on Twitter. And in doing so, you are doing quite a courageous and a heroic act in and of yourself. So what this is called the common knowledge effect. And the best way to emphasize what this is known as the hidden profile task. So this was completed by Stasser and Titus in 1987. It's a very simple task. So I want you to imagine a group of 10 people. So they get a group of 10 people into a study, and they show 9 people that option A is the best. Now, this can be with respect to behaviors, thinking, whatever it may be. They'll show 9 of that group that option A is the best. They'll show them some evidence to support that option A is the best. But actually, option B is the best. And what they'll do is they'll just show one individual the evidence which conclusively shows that option B is the best. So option A isn't actually the best. 9 people have been led down a path that they believe option A is the best. And one individual has been shown that option B is the best. They've been given the evidence, and then they're put into a group, and they are asked to discuss this. They're asked to raise points that might suggest option A is the best, and they're asked to come to an eventual decision on whether they want to go for option A or they want to go for option B. Now, the first thing to note is that generally speaking, at the end, the group will still decide that option A is the best. Now, you might think, why? Because one person has been given the evidence that option B is the best. And this is the common knowledge effect, because the majority of the time that the group spend discussing, they'll be given, say, 10 minutes. The majority of time that they spend discussing will be option A, because the majority of the group have the common knowledge that option A is the best decision. And obviously, the person that knows that option B is the best decision still knows all of these potential benefits of option A. So the majority of the time will be spent discussing option A. So even if the individual brings up the potential that option B might be better, it's spent such a small time is spent discussing that the eventual decision will not be that option B is the better decision. So this is common knowledge in that if the majority of the FPL community think that Rafinha is the best option, we've got all this evidence that Rafinha is the best option, but one person's got this evidence that might be that actually you might not have considered Demarai Gray might get another fixture in game week 27. Demarai Gray's actually got some fantastic underlying statistics here. They've got this extra piece of evidence that potentially the community haven't discussed. As a result, they might not bring that up because the majority of the time spent will be discussing option A, i.e. Rafinha. And also this does link to groupthink in that the person that knows that option B might be better, i.e. Demarai Gray, might not want to disrupt this harmony and they might not even bring that up. And scarily, Liu et al. In 2012 found that when there are hidden profiles, i.e. when someone knows that there might be a better option, but the majority of time is spent discussing the thing that everyone in that group knows, we are 8 times less likely to arrive at the correct decision. That is scary. 8 times less likely to arrive at the correct decision. So here's my advice for this. Is number one, again, do not be afraid to disrupt the status quo. If you have evidence that you think that the entire FPL community might be making an incorrect decision, speak up. Yeah, you might end up looking a bit stupid if they end up making the correct decision. But at the very least, what you're doing is you're encouraging people to challenge the status quo. So please, if you've got some evidence that you think someone might be great, drop it in my comments. Reply to people on Twitter, try and challenge the status quo, suggest logical alternatives, because in doing so, we're less likely to succumb to group polarization, groupthink, herd mentality, and the common knowledge effect, where we just end up all basically discussing the same player across the entire week. This is the best player, this is the best player, this is the best player. In doing so, we convince ourselves that they are, and we don't consider logical alternatives. So please do that. That's my key piece of advice. And just on Twitter, be willing to challenge the status quo. I guess my second piece of advice is do research, but don't just rely on one tool. And we know that that's called the law of instrument, where we rely on one tool. But don't just rely on the eye test. Don't just rely on social media. Don't just rely on Fantasy Football Scout or Fantasy Football Fix. Because in doing so, if you only use one instrument, you're likely to get the same level of knowledge that other people are. Or don't just rely on expected goals. Think about touch maps. Think about shots. Think about all of these things. Because in doing so, you might find that one piece of evidence which suggests that actually the community and the general public might be making a mistake. So beware of the common knowledge effect. Try not to always just keep discussing the same player over and over again. That's why I'm always trying to discuss, not even differentials, but I'm trying to acknowledge that there might be other decisions that you can make and try and provide you with the evidence to suggest that that might be a potential other decision. And in doing so, we're not succumbing to common knowledge effect. I guess this is the very mantra of my channel, is to not succumb to the common knowledge effect, to try and suggest logical alternatives and to try and suggest different ways in thinking. So I advise you, if you're a content creator, definitely to be aware of this, but also if you just consume content, beware of the common knowledge effect. So I'm going to move on to now the role of social media and mental health. How bad is it? Now, I'm not an expert in mental health. I've not studied this enough, specifically the role of social media and mental health in FPL, to give you a definitive answer, but I can give you a few opinions, definitely. And I've not really discussed it too often on this channel, but during my PhD, of course, my PhD is focused on virtual reality and skill acquisition, but we're doing a little side project and we're running a series of studies looking at the role of mental health in fantasy football. Is it all bad? Are there potentially any positives? And if there are negatives, how can we approach that and deal with that so that the negatives aren't quite as bad as they potentially are at the moment? Now, we have just published a study looking at the role of mental health and fantasy football. We conducted a questionnaire with over 2,000 fantasy football managers, and we asked them a series of questions to try and identify what were the potential issues with fantasy football that led to poor mental health. Of course, we want to do more studies. This is not a definitive answer. This is not exhaustive. We will be conducting future studies as well. But here are some of the things that we found. Firstly, higher fantasy football experience led to significantly better mental health. Now, what we mean by this is that the longer that you've been playing the game, the negative aspects of mental health weren't quite as significant for those managers. Now, this could be due to 2 reasons. Number one, it could be that you've developed an emotional numbness. What we mean by this is that once you've experienced a negative event over and over again, you develop a numbness to that event, i.e. it can't hurt me as much as it did the first time. If you go through a series of breakups, it's likely that the final breakup that you go through won't affect you the same way the first one did, because you've developed that ability to be emotionally numb to that event. And that goes for fantasy football to some extent. The second potential explanation for that is that over time, you develop defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms that allow you to cope with negative outcomes. So we've discussed them on my channel, for example, the potential 5x5 rule, the potential social distancing rule, distraction methods. There are lots of different things that you can develop to help you deal with negative outcomes in FPL. And maybe elite FPL managers that have been playing the game for a long time have developed some of these coping mechanisms, and in doing so, when they feel themselves starting to get negatively affected, they can deploy these coping mechanisms. So that's definitely interesting. That definitely over time there appears to be a trend that you can develop coping mechanisms of some kind and therefore have better mental health associated with FPL. We also found that being in more fantasy football leagues led to significantly worse mental health. By this, we mean that if you're in more leagues, you're more likely to be depressed, anxious, potentially have lower cognitive functioning over a period of time associated with FPL. Now, this is probably due to the fact that when you have a bad FPL week, rather than it just impacting your rank or potentially just impacting one league, it might be that impacts various leagues. So when you have one bad week, not only is it going to impact one rank and one league, it's impacting like 20 different things. So I guess this is almost amplifying the negative aspects of FPL. Also, this is just my interpretation of it. This wasn't found in the results section, but it could potentially be that those that are in more leagues are potentially in cash leagues, and therefore not only is it affecting potentially your rank and your pride, it might also be affecting you financially as well. So there are a few things associated there, but potentially if you are affected by the negative aspects of the game and you're in tons of leagues, maybe next year cut down the amount of leagues you're in, or potentially cut down the amount of cash leagues you might be in. And then point 3, and this was the key point, and this was the thing that was covered in popular media. You might have seen it was like in Lad Bible, The Times, Guardian, etc. It was covered in a lot of social media and popular media. The more time spent playing, researching, and thinking about FPL led to significantly worse mental health. Essentially, what we're saying is that the more engaged managers, those that spent more time engaging with fantasy football, were more likely to experience the negative effects of that with respect to their mental health. Now, it's difficult to try and understand this without carrying out interviews, without carrying out more studies, and we are going to do that in the future. But what this does suggest is that for us engaged managers, we might be suffering the negative aspects of FPL. And the reason that this applies to social media so thoroughly is because I think that, generally speaking, and this isn't always the case, but the more engaged FPL managers, the managers that do really take it seriously, do end up jumping on FPL Twitter. And that's because a lot of the elite managers are on there. There's some fantastic content. It's so easy to gain readily available information. And therefore, I think a lot of the elite managers will be on FPL Twitter. Now, of course, some of the elite managers might have higher experience. They might be able to deal with it thoroughly. But for those of us that are new managers and have only just started playing the game and are on social media, I think that we do need to be very, very careful, because this might amplify the negative aspects of FPL. If you're considering why does social media affect our mental health so much, I personally think that the reason for that might be that it forces us to make so many social comparisons. Again, this isn't necessarily something that's been proven recently with respect to fantasy football, but I suppose the times when I feel most negatively affected by fantasy football is, number one, when I've had a poor week. So there's definitely something associated with performance as well. But number two, when I've had a poor week and I'm scrolling through social media and I'm seeing everyone again and their dog scoring 90 plus points when I've just scored 60 points. They've all got green arrows. They've all got ranks above 10k, it seems. It forces us to make so many social comparisons. In the space of 1 minute, I can make a social comparison with my incredibly poor score with 100 other FPL managers. That's not particularly healthy. And so that aspect of social media I don't like. Now, if you're asking about ways to remove that negative aspect, I guess there are a number of ways to do it. You can use those basically coping mechanisms that I've discussed in the past. Basically social distancing, thinking about in 5 years' time, am I going to be effective? Is it that big of a deal that it's going to impact my everyday life in a year's time? So you can use some of these methods as well. But my big piece of advice here is just get off of social media. If you've had a poor week and if you are not dealing well with social media and you're not dealing well with the social comparisons that you're having to make to other managers and you've had a red arrow, just get off social media. There's really very little to be gained by having a really poor week and then scrolling through and seeing everyone else do fantastically. So that would be my major probably reasoning for why social media can lead to poor mental health in fantasy football, is that element of social comparisons. And my number one piece of advice to deal with that is just to get off social media until those social comparisons aren't going to affect you to that extent, and also use some of the techniques we've discussed in the past, such as social distancing. So self-distancing, I should say, not social distancing. I've probably been saying self-distancing. You can socially distance as well. That would help as well. So that's part 7. That's a bit of a discussion around social media and mental health. Also just mental health and fantasy football. We will be conducting more research into fantasy Premier League and mental health, and in doing so, hopefully uncover some of the reasons and also deal with some of these reasons and hopefully have some solutions in the past so that there is very, very limited negative aspects associated with fantasy football. all of that being said, I suppose the first 7 parts are all me giving negatives associated with social media. You could succumb to this bias. You could succumb to this social phenomenon. You could potentially have poor mental health. But there are definite positives. So in part 8, I just want to look at some potential positives associated with being a member of the FPL community over on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, whatever it may be, because there are definitely potential positives in there. So social media isn't all bad, and I've listed 4 key things here, which I think are incredibly positive elements that you can associate with being a member of the FPL community on any social media platform. And I would say that social media at points, different areas of it can be absolutely horrifying. And especially things like football Twitter, incredibly abusive and not necessarily areas that I would personally want to interact with. If you go onto the FPL community, we're a bunch of teddy bears. Everyone's so kind, everyone's so caring, forgiving. And if you ever have a bad week, you will be showered with love and affection, and people will try and help you. And that's why I love the FPL community. And I'm not saying that social media isn't all bad. I actually think there are a lot of terrible aspects of social media in general, which is beyond the scope of this video. But the FPL community in general is fantastic. So here are 4 key things that I think are positives associated with being in some kind of FPL community on social media. The first is related to self-determination theory. You might have come across self-determination theory in some of your different modules if you've been to university recently, or to school, or to university, or to college. Self-determination theory essentially tries to address the potential reasons that we have these growth tendencies and why we are motivated as individuals. And I'm not talking about motivated with respect to just like fancy Premier League. I'm talking about motivation in general, our innate human growth tendencies. So they say that there are 3 potential things that we need to have high perceived of in order to be able to grow, to be motivated, and to be satisfied in life. So the first of those is high perceived competence. They say that we need to feel like we are able at whatever we're doing in life. We feel like we need to be able. We feel like we want to feel high perceived ability to do these tasks. So if we're applying that to FPL, we want to feel like we're good at FPL. If we're applying it to university, we want to feel like we are good at university. We want to feel like we are able individuals. The second is autonomy. Autonomy gets that idea that we want freedom in our choice. We want to feel like we can control our behaviors and actions. We don't want to feel like we have limited control over our end outcome. And FPL does have a slight issue with that, in that we don't always have the ability to control what we're doing. So that's high perceived competence, high perceived autonomy. And the third is high perceived relatedness. And that's what we're getting at here. It says that one of the most critical things to have high motivation, satisfaction in life is we want to feel related and connected to other individuals. We want to build meaningful social relationships. And if we don't do that, we can suffer with a lack of motivation, a lack of satisfaction in life, and eventually potential depression as well. Specifically with the lockdown, and specifically with a lot of us that might be potentially quite shy, we might not go out in our everyday life. I'll be honest, I'm not particularly extrovert, specifically with going out, sort of drinking, that sort of stuff. So the social media, and specifically the FPL community, can allow us to meet our basic psychological need of relatedness. It can allow us to build meaningful social relationships. We can build some long-term friends. I've built so many friendships, specifically with like my Rap Tier community, my Rap Tier members. Remember, you can join our Rap Tier community by clicking the join button down below. I consider every single one of those guys friends, and I've built so many meaningful relationships with those. And in doing so, we can meet this need of relatedness, therefore improving our motivation and improving our satisfaction in life. So just by being a member of a community and like a social media environment can be incredibly important, specifically with the lockdowns that we've had recently. So I don't think we can underestimate how incredible it is building friendships online, specifically in relation to Fantasy Premier League, because you've got that common viewpoint, you've got that common hobby, I should say. And so I think it is incredibly important that you do build social relationships. And if doing so online can help you, definitely take that up. The second point is that connectedness and community are the 2 of the elements of gaming that are most beneficial for improving mental health. So there's been a lot of research in the past that suggests that gaming can actually boost your mental health. But the elements of gaming that can boost our mental health aren't things such as addiction. They're not the elements of literally sitting there in front of a screen and mastering a skill, although that can potentially help. It's the element of community and connectedness. Again, if you've ever played gaming before, and I'm talking about things such as like Call of Duty or FIFA, the most fun elements are when you jump on a call or a party with your friends, maybe when you play pro clubs or you play these different elements, and it's that laughter and that enjoyment, that community that you can build with your friends. And so there is quite a lot of evidence that the parts of gaming which are so beneficial for our mental health are these elements of connectedness and community. And FPL, in and of itself as a game, is completely individual. You create your team, you build your team, and you try and win. So it's a very individualized and sometimes can be quite lonely game. The thing that brings the joy out for me is creating content on YouTube or potentially being in the FPL community on Twitter. So if you want to improve your mental health associated with FPL, there is evidence to suggest that the best elements that you can bring are that connectedness and community. Point 3 is that it can, and this isn't associated necessarily with mental health here, but it can give us access to different perspectives and strategies which allow us to challenge and improve our thinking. I've learned so much about myself with respect to challenge, risk-taking, patience from playing Fantasy Premier League by understanding what other people do and what makes other people tick and what other elite managers do in an FPL setting. And in doing so, I've improved not only my decision-making within FPL, but my decision-making within greater life as well. So this ability to access so many different viewpoints, so many different perspectives can really boost the way in which we make decisions. And point 4 is the ability to share our proud moments. Firstly, if we got 120 points each week, but there was no one to share it with, it can be incredibly boring, incredibly lonely. Again, the best part about getting a great week is jumping on Twitter, saying I got a 500k green arrow, I've pushed into the top 100k, I scored one of the most points this game week, I had a game week rank of 9. It's so great sharing those moments. And again, the FPL community will hype you up and they'll celebrate those moments with you. And equally, you can get support for those down moments. So I said, if you're having a down moment, I would personally get off of social media. But if you're not necessarily too worried about making those comparisons, but you do want some support when you've had a bad week, I guarantee if you make a post on social media and you say, had a really bad week, guys, feeling really, really down about it, would like some support, I guarantee you will be flooded with either DMs or comments on that post with people supporting you, because that's what the community does. So it can allow us to share our proud moments and support us for our down moments as well. And in doing so, we are sharing our experiences with people beyond just ourselves. So I guess what I want to say here is that I love being a part of the FPL community, and most of the dark side of social media is just things to acknowledge if you want to optimize our decision making. There is some mental health related stuff which we do need to address, but generally speaking, I think as long as you approach it in the correct fashion, I think that the pros outweigh the cons for social media. But what I would say is I would definitely address some of those social concepts, i.e. just make sure that you understand things such as groupthink, common knowledge effect, group polarization, beware of the Twitter bubble, etc. As long as you are making sure you are aware of these different concepts and you try to acknowledge them in your decision making, you'll be absolutely fine. I encourage everyone to jump over onto social media to join the FPL community, and hopefully in doing so you will improve the way that you approach the game. So guys, there you have it. That is FPL Psychology episode 4, the dark side of social media. But as we said at the end, it's not all bad. I do encourage everyone to get involved because it just allows us to share our moments and to get so many different perspectives on FPL. And I do think it will improve the way you approach the game for sure, as long as you're someone that can cope with those sides, those potential dark sides of social media. I hope you are enjoying the FPL Psychology 101 series. If you have any ideas for things that you want me to cover in future episodes, do let me know down below. I'm always happy to take on board potential recommendations. I've, of course, got about 15, 20 things that I think I could cover in future videos. But if there are things that you specifically want, let me know down below. If you see someone suggest something that you think would be interesting to cover, like their comments, so that I can know it's a popular comment and I might potentially cover that in the next video. The next video will be a 10,000 subscriber Q&A, which will be out hopefully on Monday. And then after that, we've got some more content. I'm going to be rating some of your teams and giving you some potential advice. We've then, of course, got the game week preview, streams, team selections as well. So there's so much content still to come before game week 24. If you are new to the channel and you do want to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated. We've just hit, of course, 10,000 subscribers, which I'm so very happy with. Also, remember to like, comment, and also, I've just grabbed it here. You can, of course, pick up a copy of my book, The Mind Game. So if you've enjoyed today's Psychology 101 video, you're enjoying the series in general, and you've still not picked up a copy, make sure you do. There is so much covered in it. You definitely get your money's worth. There are questionnaires in there to find more about yourself. There is so much covered. So please do potentially consider picking up a copy. But until next time, guys, thank you so much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.